everyone. Welcome to Nature Nuggets Wetlands Part 2. We already talked about what a wetland is and why they are important. So we're going to start discussing some of the creatures that we might find living in a wetland. And in this second video, we actually are going to talk about a specific group of animals, which are amphibians. And if you guys watched the videos on reptiles, you might remember me mentioning amphibians just a little bit because they share a lot of the same characteristics as reptiles. So we're going to talk about some of their characteristics now, and we're going to start with some of the things that they have in common with reptiles that might sound kind of familiar. So first things first, amphibians, much like reptiles and mammals and birds, are vertebrates. That means that they have a backbone, and we can see the backbone on the frog skeleton right here. So they are vertebrates, like us. Now, unlike us, they are also what we call cold-blooded. That means that their bodies don't work to regulate their internal body temperature. So, like on a cold day, our bodies work to keep us warm. They work to produce heat. We might even shiver if we get too cold. Amphibians, like our frog, their bodies would be dependent on that cold weather. So their bodies would not work to keep them warm. And reptiles share the same characteristic. Now, when I talked about reptiles, I gave you guys a better word to use for this, if you guys remember it. Amphibians or reptiles are what we call ectothermic. Okay, ecto means outside, and thermic is referring to temperature. So ectothermic animals, like our frog, like our amphibians, like our reptiles, are dependent on the outside to regulate their temperature. Endothermic animals, like us, regulate our internal temperature from the inside. We're not dependent on the outside. All right, so that's two characteristics. They are vertebrates, they are ectothermic, and those are both things that they share with reptiles. Now, one of the things that makes amphibians very, very different from reptiles is how they start life. So when we talked about reptiles, we talked about how all reptiles, even reptiles that live in the water, lay their eggs on land. So remember, we talked about sea turtles laying their eggs on land. Amphibians do the opposite. They lay their eggs in the water. And this is really important because amphibian eggs don't have that shell, that amniotic shell that keeps reptile eggs and bird eggs from drying out. That shell is what allows reptiles to lay their eggs on land. Since amphibians don't have that, they have to lay their eggs in the water, otherwise they would just dry up and we would have a bunch of shriveled eyeballs. So this right here is a bunch of frog eggs, right? Now, if y'all are familiar with the frog life cycle, frogs don't actually start off as frogs. They start off as tadpoles. So one of the defining characteristics of amphibians is they actually live on land and on water at different times of their life. So the word amphibian means two-lived. So like our frogs, their tadpoles are in the water, right? The eggs are laid in the water, the tadpoles hatch, and eventually those tadpoles transition to life on land. So a lot of amphibians go through what we call metamorphosis. And metamorphosis is just a big science word that means they go through a really big change. So let's actually go ahead and talk about that frog life cycle. So a mother frog, here's a mother frog, will lay her eggs in the water like we said. They look like a bunch of jelly eyeballs. In a few days, these eggs will hatch, and out will come a tadpole. Sometimes when we take kids to see the pond and look for frogs and tadpoles, they see these little things swimming and they think they're fish. But they're not. A lot of times they look like a black circle and a little wriggly tail when we see them outside. But here's our tadpole. Now, tadpoles, since they live in the water, they don't have lungs like us. They have gills in order to get oxygen from the water, right? And they have a tail that helps them swim. So they're adapted to live life in the water. Now, frogs, of course, we find them around water, but we also find them on land. So eventually this guy is going to go through metamorphosis and transition to being adapted to live life on land. So the first thing that happens is when the tadpole gets big enough, when he has enough energy stored and he's ready to start transforming, the first thing that happens is he grows little back legs. And we can see these starting to form right here. So the back legs start to grow. And then the front legs start to grow, right? And those front legs can become even more developed. And we can even see his head is starting to change to look more like a frog. And eventually, he'll turn into a little froglet. And we can see the froglet has just a little bit left of a tail. So a lot of people think that this tail that the tadpole starts with and that it kind of has as it's transforming just falls off. But that's not true. What happens is as the tadpole is going through metamorphosis, it's not just the outside of the body that's changing, it's also the inside. So inside, all of his organs are rearranging. Instead of gills, he's starting to grow lungs so he can start to breathe air. And all of that changes inside of his body makes it very difficult or impossible for him to eat. So he can't find food, he can't digest food. And so what does he do for energy? Well, in this tail, there's all kinds of energy stored up. So as the tadpole is going through metamorphosis, it will start using that energy from the tail and using it to fuel its change and all of the body functions it has. And eventually that tail gets shorter and shorter as that energy gets used up, and that tail basically gets sucked back into the body. Okay, it gets reabsorbed back into the body. So when the froglet transitions from here to here, that tail hasn't fallen off. It's just been sucked in to the body as that energy has been used up. And then, of course, eventually it'll use up all that energy and we have our fully adult frog. And this, by the way, is a leopard frog. So that's just a little bit of a brief overview of the frog life cycle. It's probably something that y'all are familiar with, but sometimes it's more involved than what we necessarily think of, right? Because I bet a lot of y'all didn't know that the tail gets reabsorbed and that tadpoles, as they're changing, can't eat. So, just to rehash what we've talked about so far, we've talked about amphibians, that they are vertebrates, that they are ectothermic, that they lay their eggs in the water, and that they transition from life in the water to life on land, and they go through metamorphosis. Now, frogs aren't the only type of amphibian that we can find around a wetland. One of the other really cool ones that we have are salamanders, and I need to find my sheet. Aha! Are salamanders. So if you guys remember when I was talking about reptiles, I mentioned how a lot of kids don't believe me when I tell them, oh, we don't have any lizards here. And they tell me, no, I've seen one. Which y'all have seen are probably salamanders, which are not reptiles. They are amphibians. They start off their life in water or in a very moist environment. Amphibians also need moisture. Their skin needs to stay moist. It's not scaly like a reptile. So even once they become adults and they can live on land, they need to be in a moist environment. So salamanders, depending on the species, will either lay their eggs in a wet environment or they'll find somewhere moist, like where there's a lot of moisture under decaying leaves, and lay their eggs. So a lot of salamanders use vernal pools, and these are some of the temporary wetlands that we were talking about earlier. So these areas, they fill up with water when the spring comes, when the snow starts to melt, when rain comes. And as the year progresses, the season progresses, and it gets hotter, they dry up and they are no more. But these areas that collect water, usually like depressions where the runoff water collects, can be really great areas for animals like salamanders to raise their young, because there aren't as many predators. Since they dry up, there's no fish. So salamanders can safely lay their eggs there and not have to worry about something coming to eat them. So one of the really cool things I wanted to show you guys is we have one of the salamander species we have right here. The eastern newt actually has an extra life stage. So most salamanders, they lay their eggs. There's a larval stage that hatches out of the eggs. They spend some time in the water, anywhere between a few weeks and a few years, depending on the species and some of the conditions. And then they transition to life as adults, and they can live life on land near the water. This salamander, however, has what's called a red eft stage. Eft being E-F-T. Eft. And this stage is a bright, bright red-orange color, and this picture didn't show it very well, so I marked it in my field guide, and I'll show you guys in just a second. Right here. And I wanted to point this one out because this is probably one that y'all have seen. A lot of times salamanders, they prevent themselves from being eaten by hiding and camouflaging. So some don't come out except to find a mate and lay eggs, which is, once a year. So a lot of the times they're very hard to find. But this guy, the red eft, it stands out. Remember we talked about warning colors when we talked about monarch butterflies. This salamander uses the same strategy. It's this bright red orange to tell predators, I'm very toxic. So he doesn't have to worry about hiding. He just kind of walks around the forest floor and no one bothers him. And they're very, very pretty. Well, when they've spent a few years in this eft stage, they will actually return to the water and develop the tail that tadpoles have, that's kind of flat and allows them to steer and swim in the water. They'll develop that again, and that's the adult stage. The eastern newt, or the red spotted newt, is another name for them. And these are ones that I also like because we find them in our pond fairly often. So that's just a little bit about amphibians and some of the ones that we find in the wetlands and their life cycles. And in the next video, I'll talk about some more bigger animals that we see. Until then.